I'm gonna give everybody about 5 minutes to get on. How's everyone doing so far?
Good, how are you?
Good. Okay, it looks like um, it's just gonna be the three of us. If other people jump on, that's awesome. If not, it is recorded for a reason. So feel free to jump in at any point with questions. The survey showed that everybody was pretty familiar with working with LGBT populations. So I aim this to be about an intermediate level. So if you have any questions about any terms or anything else, feel free to just jump in. And we'll go ahead and begin. And this will be recorded. It's just gonna be sent out on a private YouTube channel for the advocates. But do be mindful if you're sharing an example, not to not use any survivors' names or anything like that. So the first few slides are just kind of some statistics about why it's important to serve LGBT survivors. So overall, about 44% of women, according to a 2015 CDC study, experience sexual violence of some kind, compared to about 25% of men. And these studies differ on how they define sexual violence. So if the statistics don't quite add up, that's why. But you can see when you break that down to different sexual orientations, that differs greatly. So 47% of bi women were raped, and 61% experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, compared to 13% of lesbians and 44% by intimate partner, and 70% of heterosexual women, and 35% with rape, physical violence, or stalking. And then so that these are just some kind of statistics that we can see that with the prevalence of sexual assault with different sexual orientations, that bi women are the most at risk, and most, about 85% of bi women said that their sexual abusers were male, and a third of lesbian women said the same. And then this is an example of a story that I want us to think a little bit about, because it would be very easy to assume that the survivor is a heterosexual woman. So Val decided to continue with the pregnancy and told her family about it. They said being a good mother was the most important thing, and that for the sake of the baby, she should involve the father in the pregnancy. I told the man that raped me I was pregnant. He agreed that abortion was the best option and paid me $460 for the procedure, and then asked if I'd let him punch me in the stomach instead. Soon after, the perpetrator sued Val for custody and visiting rights of her daughter. She had not reported the assault to police previously because she felt a lot of self-blame, denial, and fear. A year after the assault, she chose to report. She had enough evidence for her case to be forwarded to the district attorney, and her case went in front of a grand jury, which chose not to indict their perpetrator. Because Tennessee law requires a conviction before a court could terminate a rapist's parental rights, the perpetrator in this case was able to win weekly visitations. She is also very grateful for her wife's ongoing support. She's been my rock. She has cared for me when I couldn't care for myself. She listens and is always there. She is so kind, compassionate, and understanding. Had it not been for my wife, I wouldn't have survived this. So from the initial parts of the story, you might think that Val was assaulted by a man. She is a pregnant person, that she is heterosexual, and making that assumption could really shut down Val in the exam room and when talking to her. So this really goes to show that you can't assume a survivor's identity just based on who happened to assault them, because they didn't choose that. And there's a lot of factors that may be wrapped up in that Val may be feeling blame based on her sexuality from her family, if they're claiming that she invited this upon herself, or she may be feeling like this invalidates her status as a lesbian. And we're going to unpack some of that later on. So we look at bi men are and bi women are both about equally at risk for sexual assault, and both of them are about half of bi men experience some form of abuse other than rape, and 37% experience rape, physical violence, or stalking by intimate partner. And then 40% of gay men experience some form of sexual abuse, compared to 21% of straight men. So you can see that the statistics are quite high as well for queer men. And these are, again, some of the overall statistics. And This is another survivor story, Jerome. Each of these men used different forms of grooming to ensure silence and complicity from Jerome, from a fatherly relationship to an authoritative one to a friendship. Fear of getting in trouble, Jerome kept everything that had happened a secret. He survived sexual assault by 3 different men as a child. Know who you're going to trust with this secret. Unfortunately, most boys don't, especially boys of color. We don't tell because we're taught to be men. We're taught to be breadwinners and protectors. We're not taught to be victims because being a victim implies a weakness. Because it is so difficult for children to speak experiencing sexual abuse to come forward, Jerome advises that parents practice patience with their children, ask questions, and pay attention to warning signs of grooming. It was not until Jerome met his husband that he finally confided in someone about the abuse he experienced. Of all the relationships that I had, he was the only one that I told. For decades, Jerome suppressed what had happened to him. The trauma impacted Jerome's relationships with sex, drinking, and other people, but he didn't realize it. I looked at abuse as something that just happened when I was 13. I thought it's okay and it's over. I'm now realizing that it's not okay and it's not over. It's not over until you deal with it. So we can see that this impacted Jerome lifelong and created a shame and stigma because of in part due to his identity as a man. That it was an attack on that as much as anything else, and that sexual, especially if Jerome is in a culture where he might be taught that gay men are already weak, he may feel a need to prove himself to be stronger. And then looking at trans survivors, about 50% of trans men experience childhood sexual assault and 31% experience adulthood. And it's pretty similar for trans women. And about almost 43% of them felt like gender was a contributing factor in their assault. And 12% of K through 12 trans students are sexually assaulted, and 85% of Two-Spirit women, which is a Native American gender, experience sexual assault. And I know Two-Spirit woman is an anachronism. These are people who identify both as Two-Spirit and as woman. And we can see that trans people experience high rates of polyvictimization, which is experiencing multiple forms of victimization, where, if they've experienced sexual assault, they've also experienced another form of victimization, whether that's intimate partner violence, dating violence, or something else. And the last narrative we're going to look at is Ethan's story. Unfortunately, Ethan also encountered some hurtful responses when he told people of the sexual assault, especially as it related to his gender identity. Ethan came out as a transgender man when he was 19. When he disclosed this, some people in his life told him that his identity was a result of being sexually assaulted. Not only was this untrue, but it made Ethan feel invalidated both as a sexual assault survivor and as a man. Ethan attempted to return to therapy to help him cope with these difficulties, but was turned down. I went to my local health clinic looking for counseling around sexual violence recovery. They told me they didn't have anyone who could talk to someone like me. He also tried calling a hotline for LGBTQ survivors, was surprised and disappointed when the person on the hotline asked the same hurtful questions Ethan had encountered before. He thought his identity was as a transmasculine person was a result of the sexual assault. So we can see that this too threatened Ethan's sense of identity in a way that a cisgender survivor might not experience. And it left him feeling like he didn't have any spaces, and there were no spaces specifically designed for him. So this is just kind of an overview of some of those statistics we went over. And we can see that this can happen to survivors of any identity, but survivors of color, disabled survivors, older survivors are much more at risk due to their multiple marginalized identities. So 6% of LGBT survivors were assaulted because of their identity. There is unfortunately a terrible phenomenon known as corrective rape, where an assailant will assault somebody most oftentimes a queer woman or a trans person, in order to try to turn them straight. And hate crimes have a double impact on the survivor. It's because they're feeling like they're being punished for their identity, in addition to all of the harms that they're feeling from the assault. And survivors of color and trans survivors are the most at risk, especially trans people of color, because they're being punished, quote unquote, for deviating social norms, and they're more at risk for being seen as deviating these social norms. So let's discuss some of the barriers to service that LGBT survivors face. They're unique. So they experience types of fears that we're going to unpack in a second that cisgender and heterosexual survivors, I'm going to shorten that to cishet for the rest of their presentation, don't experience. They might experience services that aren't LGBT friendly, providers that aren't culturally competent, and don't have cultural humility, lack of knowledge of the services that are being provided. They might be worried about harming their reputation or the reputation of the community. Service may be focused on cisgendered women. There may be a lot of shame and stigma that they've internalized. They may be worried that reporting could worsen the situation. So they might face systemic barriers like not having an ID, like being homeless, not having transportation, and actual or perceived costs due to worse socioeconomic status. So some of the main ones here are fear of outing themselves, and a huge barrier is a fear of confirming homophobic or transphobic bias. Many people still believe LGBT people are sexually deviant and are more likely to perpetrate crime. So if their assailant is a member of the community, they may be worried that they're confirming this bias. And that's going to be a lot more intense for survivors with multiple marginalized identities and whose perpetrators are also members of those communities. So survivors of color may experience this to a much greater degree. And the perpetrator may take advantage of this. They may say, you're going to make our community look bad. And they might be worried that they're going to be blamed because of their sexual orientation, their gender identity, or doing something associated with their sexual orientation, like if they went home with someone from a gay bar. There's internalized homophobia and transphobia that really prevents people from reporting because they blame themselves for the assault. And they may not know that the assault is sexual assault, especially if they've been groomed from a young age, because sex education is very oriented around cisgender heterosexual people, and it only talks about male on female female violence. And they may be told that they're not a real member of the community if they don't have a certain sex act or if they don't enjoy certain sex acts. Rural survivors experience all of this and more. Their communities may be a lot smaller, so the repercussions may be huger if they report. They may experience a more conservative surrounding community. There might be a lack of service and lack of transportation, a sense of isolation, and they're already experiencing in the rural community, and a fear of retaliation because they are more likely to know their perpetrator and essentially they can't escape their perpetrator. They may be also fearing retaliation from other members of the community if they report. And male survivors face a lot of stigma, especially when you add in being an LGBT man. There is still a misconception that most people who sexually abuse boys are gay. So if someone is a member of the community, they may be worried about confirming this misperception. Even though this misconception is born of the fact that sex isn't about sex. sexual assault isn't about sex. It's about power and control. So most of people who sexually abuse boys or identify as heterosexual men. They're just taking power over a person that does not have it. They maybe were face a misconception that they are gay because they were abused. Similar to what we saw in the case of Elliot, of Ethan, who was told that he was trans because he was abused. The strategies for self-care, like, for example, things like starting yoga groups, might be oriented towards things that are typically stereotypically seen as feminine, so they might not feel that they're welcome in those spaces, or those strategies might not work for them. There may be a self-doubt around their masculinity. It's very common for survivors to question their sexuality after assault, especially if there's any ejaculation during the assault, and they may be afraid that they're going to be seen as the perpetrator if they're coming into these spaces. And trans survivors experience huge rates of dysphoria, especially when undergoing any type of genital examination, let alone one after an assault. And their perpetrator may have played up on this by referring to their anatomy in ways they didn't want, touching their anatomy in ways that caused dysphoria and the like. They may be worried about being misgendered. They might not have a valid ID. They might be worried about being harassed, assaulted, or arrested because one half of Black trans women go through the criminal justice system. So they have a large reason to distrust the police. And there are also huge victimizations. There's the fact that many survivors have to rely on sex work, and they may be worried if they were relying on sex work or they're going to be arrested for that. The perpetrator may tell them that no one will believe them due to social power differentials. If they're in an abusive relationship, they might not be able to leave the house due to that, or such as things like abuse or restricting access to their gender affirming medications and the like. And they may be more likely to be abused by a person in power. So here are some, so you may be wondering, when we look at all of these barriers that I just told you, what can we do? So a lot of the things that you can do to mitigate these barriers are things you would do for any survivor, which is a good thing. So I'm just asking you to fall back on your skills that you gained in training. The main thing is to remind the survivor that this isn't their fault. They are doing if they want to report, they are doing the right thing, and to use the survivor's language. You don't have to know everything about every sexuality. You don't have to know everything about the nuances of why someone might identify as genderqueer versus non-binary. You just have to believe that person, and when they tell you that they are genderqueer, even if you think that meets that definition of non-binary, meet them where they are and use their language, because they are the author of their own experience. Validate that they are brave in coming here and reporting, and that they're keeping their community safe if they choose to report. And ask them what would make them comfortable. We assure survivors that this can happen to anybody, and that this service is intended for them. And there's going to be times that you're going to be legally obligated to share information, but if you are, ask permission before you're sharing anything that could out them. So, say, is it okay if I share your pronouns? What name do you want me to put on this documentation? And, say that, everyone at the center wants to respect your identity. Our nurses are really well trained, and we work with our detectives, and they also are pretty well trained as well. But even then, especially, sometimes we work with Bibb County Correctional, things like that. If you notice someone misgendering the survivor, pull them out of the room and say, hey, can I talk to you about something really quick? And say, hey, she uses she, her pronouns. please respect her name. This is really important. I know that you're going to get this right. If you tell someone that you're assuming they have the best intentions, whether or not they actually do, they're going to feel more likely to live up to your good expectations. And like we went over in Val's case, don't assume survivor sexuality based on the gender of the offender. Here are some techniques for working with trans survivors. Like I said, use their chosen name, pronouns, and identity. You want to, try to minimize the time that the survivor is undressed and the number of people seeing the survivor. We always want to give a survivor the right to not have us in the room, but you definitely want to ask for the trans survivor, would you like me to step outside? And ask them how they want us to refer to their anatomy. Many survivors get dysphoria around terms like breast, vagina, penis, testicles, and say, what do you want us to call it? And explain before we get to that checklist of questions that the nurse has to ask. Was there anal penetration? Was there vaginal penetration? Was there oral penetration? Explain why we have to ask this, that it's for legal reporting purposes, and that we're going to have to use some very specific medical jargon. But we will try to use what the best terms possible for you. And again, use gender neutral terms to refer to any other parties involved until the survivor does otherwise. So now we're going to talk a little bit about working with LGBT youth. So LGBT youth are more at risk for adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, so which can impact a child's lifelong development. So when a child has an adverse childhood experience, their brain chemistry actually changes. So it releases more of the stress hormone, cortisol, and it increases that flight or flight reflex, and it increases the risk of developing social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, with high-risk health behaviors, disease, disability, and even early death. Cortisol can impact whether or not your arteries are going to be clogged, to your quality of sleep, to your predisposition towards having a higher body mass, and things like that. And it also leads to socially, you developing fewer coping skills because you are having to exist in a survival mode. And unfortunately, LGBT youth experience higher rates of bullying, parents kicking them out, parents denying their identities, legalized discrimination, cultural homophobia and transphobia, abuse and neglect, police misconduct, just to name a few of these. And all of these can fall under these adverse childhood experiences and that can drastically impact a child's life. So that's to say that we really need to practice trauma-informed care when we're working with our LGBT youth, and know that they may be very reticent to trust us because they've had a lot of reason to distrust people. So unfortunately, trans youth in school, about 12% are sexually assaulted in the K-12 school system, and 78% are harassed. So you see that there's going to be lifelong risk, reduced earning potential, increased risk of homelessness, and relying on more dangerous forms of work to survive. And about 40% of homeless youth are LGBT, despite them making about 10% of the population. And LGBT youth that are homeless experience 7.4 more acts of sexual violence than their non-LGBT homeless peers. And they're experienced twice as high risk of being victimized. They're highly vulnerable to abuse and assault in shelters, and many are sorry, we're going to run out of time in 10 minutes, so I will send out a new link at that time, but no, but they're going to be much more vulnerable to assault in shelters, and they're at risk of being denied access to shelters. So we can see that parental rejection, abuse within the family, and aggression and violence within the family are some of the top 3 reasons that people LGBT youth are going to experience homelessness. And unfortunately, all of this puts them at high risk for things like like human trafficking and the like. And they may distrust things like foster care, the police, DHR because of past abuse experienced in there. So it may be very difficult to work with these youth, but and we can see that 22% are sexually abused in shelters, and 42% are forced to stay in a facility that they of a gender they didn't identify with. But here are some strategies when working with these youth. The first thing is to meet their immediate needs. Sexual assault may not be the highest priority on their list. They asking if you know a youth is experiencing homelessness, asking them if they're hungry. We always have chips in the center. We have candy. They can eat all of our chips. It does not matter. Asking them if they're, we have water. We have blankets. Making sure you're sending them back with clothes and toiletries. We do have to involve the HR for any case under 18, especially if the youth is homeless. But let them know we're going to have to involve the HR. And like I said earlier, ask permission before sharing information that could out them in any way. And we want to give these youth as much information and power as possible. So letting them know, I'm going to have to call the HR. They're going to send someone out here. You may, they're going to try to find you a place to stay. They might not find it tonight. So tonight you might be staying in their office, or you might be staying in a group home, and you might have to be moved around a few times, answering questions truthfully. And it's okay to say that you don't know. And try to be the child's advocate. You want to remind the HR, especially if the child is trans, that they need to be housed according to their gender identity, and really stick up for the child's rights to be respected if they won't. So this is a good time. We can go over some case studies. And then if we are, but before we do that, this is a good time to pause and ask for questions. And I'm gonna pause the recording so you can feel free to